All right. Thank you. Welcome. Devices away, or silenced or something. Hi, I'm Dan Rockmore, director of the William H. Newcomb Institute for Computational Science here at Dartmouth College. And on behalf of the college and the Newcomb Institute, I'd like to welcome you all to this year's Spring Donoho Colloquium. The Donoho Colloquium is an ongoing series of public lectures aimed at increasing awareness of the many important and sometimes surprising places in which computational ideas are shaping our lives. This afternoon's lecture will be delivered by the writer and journalist Michael Massing. The title of Michael's lecture is, I wasn't quite sure where to put the emphasis, Michael. Why is digital journalism so old and boring, or why is digital journalism so old and boring? These events, the lecture and subsequent events, are made possible by a generous gift from David, Mickey, and Dan Donoho in honor of Dan's graduation as a member of the class of 2006. It's a central piece of the larger mission of the Newcomb Institute, whose aim is to support and integrate computational thinking and computational ideas throughout the Dartmouth community. The Institute itself is made possible through the generosity of Bill Newcomb, Dartmouth class of 64 and former trustee of the college. As we all know, we are today awash in information, and computation is, of course, at the heart of it. While it might all start with ideas, those thoughts are often soon recorded in bits and bytes that are eventually transmitted via the airwaves and optical fiber across a spectrum of digital media. Therein, our words and images are embedded in various kinds of digital designs that work to render eye-catching presentations to capture our attention. Within the information tsunami swims the news, possibly difficult to distinguish from the not news, which we receive in any of a variety of media platforms and on a wide range of devices and materials, each with their own contextual idiosyncrasies. For example, the 2015 State of the Media report by the Pew Foundation highlights the rise of finding news through social media and the prevailing use of mobile devices, known to engender their own characteristic and possibly shallow reading patterns. Computation is, of course, not just important to the way we take in the news, but it's also critical to the kinds of news we see. Algorithms frequently guide the news feeds that we receive, and in some cases are even generating the copy that we read. Moreover, in the digital world, we are hardly passive recipients of news. Depending on what we click on and when, how long we dwell and where, this in turn can shape the kinds of news we are sent, and with that, the types of news and related investigations that are supported and prosper. News today is a complex feedback system. But news and digital media is not all about challenges. It's also about opportunity. The impact of information technology on news and public debate goes back at least to Gutenberg's 15th century invention of the printing press and the important role it played in the Protestant Reformation. Subsequent advances in technologies enabled wider and wider dissemination of news, as well as a broader diversity of voices and outlooks able to contribute to its production. The landscape of digital journalism is dynamic and diverse, able to both satisfy the curiosity of the individual and to shake societies into action. But is it more than Gutenberg on Red Bull? What and where are the missed opportunities in this new world of news? That's the question that today's speaker, Michael Massing, takes on in much of his recent work. Michael is a well-known essayist and author and is a frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books. He's a former executive editor of the Columbia Journalism Review and is a co-founder of the Committee to Protect Journalists, a New York-based organization dedicated to international freedom of the press. Michael is the author of The Fix, a critical study of the U.S. war on drugs, and Now They Tell Us, The American Press and Iraq. He is currently in the middle of a new long-term book project on the Protestant Reformation. Michael was the recipient of the 2005 Mogerson Prize, awarded by Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism for investigative reporting of the Iraq War. In 1992, he was named a MacArthur Fellow. His MacArthur citation makes mention of his, quote, tenacious research. Of late, this tenacity has in part been directed at articulating the new and missed opportunities of digital journalism. I look forward to his sharing of his thoughts in that direction tonight. Please join me in welcoming our Spring Donoho Colloquium lecturer, Michael Massing. Thanks, Michael.
Great, thank you. Thank the Newcomb Institute for having me here, and for Dan for reading my articles and thinking it would be worth coming here to speak. And to Victoria also for chaperoning me around, which has been very pleasant. I haven't been to Dartmouth before. Seeing the Orozco murals in particular I found fascinating and the story behind them, and also encouraging because sort of when you do these types of things, you sometimes try to calculate how far can you push things, what is the audience going to react, should I say this, how should I put it, and then to see Orozco like being invited to put up these murals and sort of sticking it to the man right there on the walls is really something. So I'll let things fly. Now, I don't have PowerPoint. I don't have any AV, audiovisual. There was a little shock expressed at this among the techies, and also some chortling at the irony that I'm reporting on the digital world without using that. But sometimes you need an outsider to figure out what's going on inside. So I hope to bring you some impressions from just outside the perimeter. So Dan mentioned that I've been working on this book about the Protestant Reformation, which I know seems completely afield from journalism, which I've spent a large part of my life not only doing but writing about. And I'm going to actually start talking a little bit about the Protestant Reformation, so bear with me. But it has actually shaped my thinking about journalism today, and it's been interesting to use the history as a framework for trying to figure out what's going on in the world of digital journalism. My book is actually about the rivalry between two men. One is Martin Luther, and the other is Erasmus of Rotterdam. I got interested in this, began with trips to Rome, got me interested in my ignorance of the rise of Western civilization and so on. And anyway, I did a reading program that brought me up to Erasmus, and I got fascinated by him as sort of, he was so far ahead of his time in so many ways, and basically one of the founders of humanism, who was the most celebrated intellectual of his period. He was the new Cicero toasted by everyone. And of course, today he's not that well known. And so I began, wondered why. And the answer was Martin Luther, who's 15 years younger than he, came along, force of nature, bumped Erasmus off the stage of history. And I'm trying to restore him. And my book is about what I see as the conflict between humanism and evangelical Christianity. I feel that dynamic arose in this period and is still with us, still being played out. Now, as Dan also mentioned, Gutenberg's invention in the 1450s of movable type, it is a backdrop for what I'm writing about, and that is partly where why my research on the Protestant Reformation is so relevant to today. Invention of the printing press had a transforming effect on society by making the dissemination of information easier and quicker and much more widely available. I came upon this quote from an enthusiastic book buyer sometime around the turn of the 16th century. He said, "The world is endowed with a treasure house of wisdom till now hidden from view, an infinite number of works that very few students could have consulted in Paris or Athens or in the libraries of great university towns are now translated into all the languages and scattered abroad among all the nations of the earth." So you can see a parallel to the internet today. Printing press played a key part in upending the medieval order that had reigned for 1,000 years with the Catholic Church the dominant institution. The revolt against it was led by Luther. Until 1517, he was an unknown Augustinian friar in Wittenberg, a small remote town in Saxony in eastern Germany. Luther had no army, no institution behind him, and led no party. He only had a pen and paper and access to a printing press. On October 31st, 1517, in an act that today is celebrated as the starting point of the Reformation, he posted 95 theses on the door of the castle church in Wittenberg, challenging the Pope's authority to issue indulgences, which were certificates that more or less forgave sin in exchange for a cash contribution. This very much offended Luther, the idea you could pay for forgiveness and so on. Nobody in Wittenberg paid much attention, but within weeks, the theses began appearing in print in Nuremberg, in Leipzig, in Basel, and other cities. And by the start of 1518, the theses had appeared in towns and villages throughout Germany. as if carried by the wings of angels, as one contemporary put it. Luther himself expressed amazement at how fast they spread, and Luther became a household name, and indulgences were being debated all across Germany. At the time, he said all he wanted was a hearing. These were theses for debate, for disputation, and he wanted people to come and have a disputation. Not only did nobody come, but the church, after ignoring him, tried to marginalize and silence him. But the more they pressed him, the more angry and outspoken Luther became. And he began turning out tracts and pamphlets, sermons and polemics in both Latin and German, criticizing what he saw as the greed and immorality of the clergy and the worldliness and corruption of the Holy See in Rome. In 1520, he turned out 3 tracts that together created a storm across Europe. In one, the address to the German nobility, addressed to the Christian nobility of the German nation, he called on the German aristocracy to stand up to Rome and resist the usurpations and exactions imposed on the German people by the Pope and the Curia. In the Babylonian captivity of the church, he inveighed against the decaying institutions and rituals of Rome and claimed they were no longer serving ordinary Christians. And in The Freedom of a Christian, he offered an alternative theology based on the inner faith of the individual rather than on the performing of external rituals and ceremonies and the doing of good works, which in his mind had become hollow and mechanical. So within a few months, these 3, they're called the 3 Reformation tracts. They were very revolutionary, and they came out, and they were all over Europe, and they led to the growth of a broad movement demanding renewal and reform. In April 1521, with this movement seeming unstoppable, Luther was summoned by Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, to appear before the Diet in Worms, the Diet being an assembly of every 2 or 3 years. There, Luther came, and in a room crowded with imperial and ecclesiastical officials, he was shown a pile of his books, and he was pressed to recant what was in them. Luther, in this sort of way it's come down to us, he stood up and he proclaimed, but actually he said, can I have a day to think about it? And so actually they consulted, and the emperor did give him a day, and he came back, and then he said in a famous statement that he had written all this in these books, he had done it by his own conviction, and he was bound by his conscience to stand by them, and he was willing to suffer the consequences. Now, this is one of the most dramatic moments in history, and some actually think it's the start of the modern era. There are many people who say this is the moment the modern era starts, but the spectacle of this one man standing up to the emperor and all his officials and the ecclesiastical officials and saying, I refuse to recant, is a seminal moment in Western culture. Now, Luther was given a safe conduct and allowed to leave Worms. The safe conduct was for 21 days, and at the end of it, it was assumed that they would come after him. But he was given enough time to get back to Wittenberg. But in fact, in the forest on his way back, Prince Frederick, who was his protector, the Prince of Saxony, arranged a fake abduction. And these horsemen appeared in the middle of the forest and took Luther away, and he knew it was coming, but it made it look like he was abducted. So all of Europe thought, my God, the man disappeared. And in fact, he was secreted in a castle, the Wartburg Castle, which is still there in central Germany. And from there, he continued, his whereabouts were unknown, but he continued to put forward these tracts, and he would write them and be carried by messenger back to Wittenberg, where they would be printed. And really, it created, again, the Reformation started at this point. And this one man, again, using this printing press, was doing all this. So to find out what ultimately happened to Luther, you'll have to read my book. Or you can go to Wikipedia. But anyway, I hope it'll be out next year. And Luther was a complex figure. He was very heroic, but he was also very dogmatic and intolerant at times. So I don't want it to just give one dimension. But anyway, for now, a word to describe what Luther did is disruption. A lone man using a powerful new medium, the printing press, managed to disrupt the established order and propose the intellectual and spiritual foundations for a new one. Now, disruption, here is my segue, is a term often heard today with regard to Silicon Valley and digital technology as a whole. Innovation is another. Traditional industries are being disrupted by digital innovations. Uber is displacing taxis. Airbnb is replacing booking agents. Amazon is replacing brick and mortar stores. Apple is transforming telecommunications. The news industry, of course, has been disrupted too. Actually, turmoil is not too strong a word to use for what's going on in the news business. Traditional legacy organizations, as they're called, a term I don't like, but the New York Times, the Washington Post, other newspapers are often referred to in this way, and they have been upended by the internet. So have TV networks and magazines. Newsrooms are shrinking. Investigative units are being cut back. Bureaus and state capitals are being closed. Meanwhile, there's been an explosion of digital startups offering news, information, and opinion, and playing an ever more prominent role in the news ecosystem. Social media, of course, are a big part of it too. All in all, there are 100 or perhaps 1,000 flowers blooming. Now, journalists love to write about their own industry, and these online news operations have received a tremendous amount of attention. Most of it, though, is about platforms, brands, apps, advertising, page views, business models, and public offerings. In other words, the technical and economic aspects of digital journalism. Much less attention has been paid to the journalism itself, to the content, to the quality of the news, information, and opinion being produced and disseminated. Now, from a journalistic standpoint, digital technology offers many valuable properties: speed, immediacy, interactivity, boundless capacity, global reach. These tools basically are every bit as versatile and potentially transformative as those of the printing press was in the age of Luther. Of course, people point out there are many more sources available now than were in Luther's time, so it's not a completely, 100% analogy, but you get my drift. So to me, the question is, to what degree have news organizations taken advantage of this versatile technology? To what degree has digital journalism been used in an innovative and disruptive way comparable to Luther's use of the printing press? So with the editor of my New York Review of Books, who very supportive of this enterprise, I set out to sort of do an evaluation of digital journalism, to actually do sort of a tour of sites and see how good is digital journalism. I'm one of the few people who still uses bookmarks. I go to sites, regularly check in on them. I don't make much use of Twitter, and so I don't get the type of breadth of information and of sources that you get if you use that. But it has given me the advantage that I've been following these sites over a long period of time, and so I've had a chance to sort of see how they have evolved and developed over time. And actually, back in 2009, I wrote 2 articles for the New York Review in which I was quite bullish about what was happening in online journalism. There were many outlets that seemed creative and fresh, and the field in general seemed to have tremendous promise. So my recent tour, I went back to revisit. I'd been reading them, but now to focus on these sites intensively. And I ended up dividing this tour, or how I wrote about it, into 2 parts: the first generation and second generation. So I'll talk for a minute about the first generation of sites. And sort of the flagship of the first generation is the Huffington Post. When it first came online, it seemed to me very pioneering. It used aggregation in a very creative way, taking information from a variety of sources, mixing, adding, combining, inflecting, all in a very innovative fashion. When the financial crisis hit, Huffington Post offered many diverse viewpoints and penetrating reports on the power, reach, and excesses of the big banks and other financial institutions. To me, there was a real sense of something appealing afoot. 5 or 6 years later, the thrill is gone. The site seems to me dull and flat. It's still aggregating huge amounts of material, but now it seems highly derivative. And in fact, I learned in the course of speaking to people that at the point I looked at them a year ago, 1 of every 7 articles originated with the Associated Press, with which they had a contract. So that's a huge amount to be getting from elsewhere. I really would have expected it to move toward the use of more original material. The site remains stuffed with titillating celebrity fluff of the Rachel McAdams doesn't look like this anymore variety. There are 50-plus sections, including things like healthy living, horoscope, Dr. Phil, GPS for the soul, and good news. I hope I'm not telling you things you already know. A major presence at the site is something called the third metric. The third metric is a way to measure success beyond the usual 2, money and power. It includes wisdom, wonder, meditation, and especially sleep. Arianna Huffington has made this her special cause. She has become a sleep evangelist, going around the country promoting what she calls a sleep revolution and promoting the restorative power of pajamas. People have pointed out the irony of her doing this, promoting sleep and restlessness, when her site seems so frenetic and carnival-like. Now, the Huffington Post does a lot of good work. I have to put qualifiers in. It's got a good investigative unit, which has been beefed up lately, and it has a very good Washington bureau, which does quite good reporting on politics. And it's doing more original reporting now because they realized that they were going flat. But the good material to me gets lost in all of this in the carnival. And it's anything but disruptive. It doesn't really shake things up in the way that is the standard I'm sort of using here. It seems locked in place and unable to evolve beyond its initial formula. Now, the reason for that, basically, I think, is its business model. It's a for-profit site, and it's under tremendous pressure to generate revenue. That means getting clicks and traffic, which means constantly posting. Every month, people see their numbers, or even every day in some cases. The editors get this of each section. So it promotes a journalism that's fleeting, ultimately. It's hard to actually devote the type of resources to the more penetrating types of journalism when you're constantly looking at the traffic numbers. And it has lost influence as a result. Now, I found this true of most first-generation sites. Talking Points Memo in 2000 that started as a one-man blog, very interesting. Josh Marshall had a fresh take on what was sort of an outsider in Washington. They made a great splash in 2007. Their readers were sending it. They had all these readers who were their community sending in information of what was going on around the country. And they began to see a pattern that these state attorney generals were being fired in different states. And they began to look at it, and they found that there was a political campaign going on to get rid, by the Bush administration, Bush Justice Department, to get rid of people who were politically opposed to them. And it created a huge storm. So it was remarkable that they did this by gathering information from their readers. Well, they've expanded. They have a much bigger staff. They're still using their readers. But they have not evolved really in what they're doing. And now everybody's doing this. Everybody's like mixing their opinion with some reporting, and it's hard to stand out. And the site just really has not made a type of splash equivalent to that since then. You can go to others, Slate, Salon, The Daily Beast, all which I consider vaguely first-generation sites. You can find good 1,000-word stories that are mixing opinion and reporting, and Slate's got that same old contrarianism, like the headline I found, "Why Staples' terrible sales might be a godsend for the company." Things that, are counterintuitive and try to get you to click onto the headline. But there's nothing to me that really makes you sit up and take notice on a regular basis at these places. Nothing that really shakes things up. Last year, when I was doing this research after the Charlie Hebdo killings occurred, I was hoping to see one of these sites grab this issue and offer a broader range of voices than usual on the key subjects that incident was bringing to the fore. Hate speech versus free speech, anti-Semitism, anti-Islamism. I wanted to see voices from France and from different communities about this, but no, it basically got the same stable of voices we usually do. And so that, to me, summed up the sort of way these places just have gotten stuck in place. I mean, if we take the New Yorker, here's an example. I mean, it's a little bit of a diversion, but New Yorker, of course, is a legacy publication, but it has a very well-established website. And it illustrates to me the aversion to using the web to shake things up. And you can see it in its letters section. The magazine must get hundreds of letters a week. And as I'm sure most of you read the New Yorker, and maybe 3 will get published. And they usually seem very clipped and edited down because space is at a premium. Well, you have a website. You could obviously do much more. You could run more, and you could get responses from writers. I mean, they almost never have a response from a writer to a letter. Now, the New York Review is better at this. In fact, some some people consider it the most interesting part. They go to it first because they have these back and forths that go on. So why wouldn't the New Yorker do this? You could really get, and the back and forths go on. You could have an issue, you know, because they do. They run things that occasionally get people filled with reactions. I mean, because basically you're losing a little bit of control when you do this. You know, you're letting readers have a say, and then your writer has to respond. Now it's sort of like these are letters handed down from God, you know, and like they can't really be ruffled too much. So anyway, that's to me another example of a lost opportunity. Now the top investigative site on the web is ProPublica. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this site. To me, it seems similarly constricted. It was started 10 or so years ago with a contribution from Herb Sandler, who made billions in the financial industry, and he pledged $10 million a year for several years. And the site has done a lot of good work. It's done work on the environmental effects of fracking, lax oversight of the nursing industry, mismanagement by the Red Cross in Haiti. All very good work, all the sort of bread and butter of investigative journalism in America. This type of journalism focuses heavily on environmental pollution, business fraud, managerial malpractice, workplace abuse. These are the things for which Pulitzer Prizes get awarded, and they're important. But they don't get at the broader structural realities of society. They're separate, siloed investigations rather than broad, expansive looks at how money and power operate in the world. This, generally speaking, is how investigative journalism on the web operates as well. It follows the same techniques that newspapers have traditionally used, which is not surprising since many of the people doing investigation on the web got their training in newspapers and have transferred their methodology to the web. Now, on my tour of first-generation sites, I did find one exception to the general placidity, and that was Politico. In the early years, I really didn't find it a very appealing site. It was too inside baseball, focused on the horse race aspects of Washington journalism, too inside the Beltway. Over the last few years, however, it has significantly changed. It's had a huge expansion in staff, and it's digging deeper into political life in not only Washington, but in the country as a whole. It's got a daily magazine with longer articles, a lot of policy analysis and reporting, and it has something called Political Pro, which offers detailed info on a dozen areas from healthcare and defense to transportation and education. This investment has translated into economic health. Subscriptions to Political Pro can run up to $3,000 a year, so it's become a big profit center or a revenue center. But it also points to its journalistic limitations. This is information that goes to deep-pocketed insiders, lobbyists, corporations, trade associations. That means that peons like us, if I may use the royal us, can't see it. And this arrangement also has an inhibiting effect on the journalism because it's information that's geared toward this particular inside readership. So all in all, of all the first-generation sites I looked at, Politico was the only one that has really evolved. Yet even its disruptive effect, I think, is very limited, especially when measured against Martin Luther and the printing press. How about the second generation of sites? I'm going to try to go through this quickly to get to the meat. The clear leader here is BuzzFeed, and I can tell from the audience here that not as many of you read it as the students I was meeting with earlier today. But many journalists do, and even the New York Times has studied its operations, given how skilled it has been at finding a large audience and monetizing it. BuzzFeed made its mark with listicles, GIFs, or GIFs, no one knows how to pronounce that word, cat videos, and cute headlines. But in fact, the site has evolved some. A few years back, it realized that its readers wanted more than cute animal stories. And so it began making a push into serious journalism. It brought Ben Smith from Politico to run its political coverage and Miriam Elder from The Guardian to oversee foreign coverage. In terms of that coverage, BuzzFeed has distinguished itself in some areas like marriage equality, LGBT issues. But overall, when I was reading it, I really was struck by how conventional most of its reporting was. You could find much of its material on a wire service or at a metropolitan newspaper. And investigations dealt with the same old topics, not old, but the same managerial malfeasance, workplace abuses, conflicts of interest. All in all, its journalism seemed nowhere near as pioneering as its sleek platform. Actually, BuzzFeed, though, has gotten better. I was told by an editor there that they were thinking of hiring someone, a young Muslim in England, to report on what it's like as a young Muslim to live there, and another journalist to write about what it's like to be a woman in India. These seem to me fresh ideas and the basis for a potentially new approach to covering the world. One focused more on the grassroots. So much of mainstream journalism's coverage of the world focuses on war, conflict, terrorism, insurgencies, and political rivalries. BuzzFeed, I felt, could offer something truly unconventional and pioneering, how people actually live their lives. So I wrote this in my article, and after it was published, I heard back from the PR person I'd worked with there. I went to the office, talked to people, and she thanked me for taking the time to visit and said she found my take interesting, and hopefully we will impress you more as we continue to experiment and grow, especially across our news organization. So in anticipation of this talk, I did go and look more at BuzzFeed, and I have to say, they're doing more of this, not because of me, but they had, for instance, an article titled, "Muslims Used to Love Living in Tennessee, Now It's a Nightmare." And it was a very interesting piece of what has happened since the attacks in Paris, since Trump, and so on and so forth. And there are other on-the-ground pieces like this. So there's a seed of something interesting going on there. So maybe they will move in a more creative direction, but it's still, given the amount of attention it gets and how much, what their platform, it's a very pioneering platform, but they have not, the journalism is nowhere as pioneering as the technology. That would be my bottom line on BuzzFeed. And BuzzFeed has been copied by many other places. Quartz, Fusion, Business Insider. Business Insider, for instance, a headline, 10 things you need to know before the opening bell. Again, it's this quick journalism trying to generate hits. And generally, it's forgettable. Two other sites that have made a big splash are Vox and 538. Both of them started by very entrepreneurial, talented journalists who started at mainstream publications and became so big they decided to go out on their own. Ezra Klein was at the Washington Post, started Wonk Blog. It was a huge hit, and he decided to start Vox. And so I studied Vox, I read it, and what they specialize in is explanatory journalism. They use card stacks, which are virtual note cards on subjects like campaign finance, obesity, voting rights, and gun violence. So if you want to know about those issues and get a good backgrounders on it, you can go there and do it. But what I was struck by Vox is there's no sense of outrage at the place. There's no sense of like, look at what is going on, and we want to like really take this issue on and shake people up about it. I'm sorry to keep coming back to these images, shaking things up, stirring things up, but these things are too even-keeled. And too respectable, you know? It isn't like the Orozco murals and getting out there and sort of really shaking people up. 538, you all probably know Nate Silver. You know, he became a sensation in the New York Times with his predictions and polling and seemed infallible. So he went out and under the arm of ESPN, he has started 538, which of course is the number of electoral votes in the presidential race. And so he's applied his whole data-driven methodology to all kinds of areas. NCAA brackets, Academy Awards. You would not believe how much, if you wanted to know the odds, every passing week of different films and actors and actresses winning awards, you could go there. To me, it's sort of like part of the overall mall that you get in online journalism. I mean, who needs all this? And now I wrote, and other people felt, that with the presidential campaign, Silver's site would again rise because it's such an oracle, you know. But in fact, he got the whole Trump phenomenon wrong, and he's had to do a mea culpa like so many others. So Vox and 538 both, for me, typify a problem with much digital journalism, which is not that much actual reporting. A lot is done with things that you can find on the web. There's not that much going out into the field. There's not even that much picking up of the phone. And there's a much remarked on phenomenon in digital journalists' newsrooms, which is the quiet. You don't hear people picking up, interviewing, and so on. Now, I'm painting with a broad brush here, so obviously some of this gets done. And also, the traditional news organizations in predicting Trump and everything else have not done any better. So, another caveat. Now, there are many single-topic niche sites that are doing good work. There's Inside Climate, which reports on environmental despoilation. And it's one of the first, or maybe the first, web-based news operation that won a Pulitzer Prize. There's the Marshall Project, which is doing a bang-up job on criminal justice and has really, in fact, taken that on and has shaken things up a little bit, although criminal justice is now, everybody is on it. It's like you don't get people angry so much. And also, a lot of it was social media and Black Lives Matter and all these videos that came up that really provoked a lot of, it wasn't necessarily journalism. The journalists, though, have done a good job after this became an issue through that. And there's the Hechinger Report and a number of education sites that are doing good work in that area. All of these sites are solid, and they're providing more information at your fingertips than even the most well-connected person could have had before. The quote I cited earlier about the printing press, you know, you could now making available to the whole world things you could only get in a library is really true with the internet as well. But I'm sorry to say that so many of these sites are really not very fun to read, at least for the general reader. If you're following that field, the environment, criminal justice, yes, you'll go there. But I actually don't go to those sites. They're not among my bookmarks. They're too specialized. Even something that began with as much fanfare as The Intercept seems to me to not grab people in the way that it could. As you all, I'm sure, know, or many of you, this grew out of the NSA revelations by Edward Snowden. It was formed by Glenn Greenwald, Laura Poitras, and Jeremy Scahill, three very high-profile journalists, and backed by the money of Pierre Omidyar, who made billions with eBay and who pledged $250 million over 5 years. At first, the site was almost exclusively about surveillance. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, surveillance, NSA, counterterrorism. I would check in with it to see, because I know people work there and it's so high profile. And I just said, what is this? You can't just do this all the time. It's not enough to sustain a site. And sure enough, they realized this as well. And they brought in an editor from The Nation who's now trying to do much more work on sort of money and politics, lobbying. They have done almost nothing on Silicon Valley. And I just find this amazing that a site that is about surveillance is only looking at the NSA and has done very little about Google. And so I'm going to get to that in a little while. But they're doing more of this. They're finally coming around. So a big question in all this is impact. Do these sites have impact? That's what Martin Luther had. It's another way of saying disruption. A good counterexample is the Boston Globe's series on sex abuse in the Catholic Church, which I'm sure many of you saw Spotlight. And so that's an example of impact and disruption. They produced 600 articles on the subject and helped change the entire debate on this issue. If you've seen the movie, you see at the end how they show all the cities, not only in America, but around the world, where there were revelations in the wake of their series about this scandal, because they managed to just sort of pull the veil off of it. And suddenly, people were coming forward. I mean, it's a great story of how journalism can have an impact. Another example I like to cite is Alan Schwartz of the New York Times. He picked up the beat of the issue of concussions in journalism. And for 4 years, he reported more than 100 articles on this, just doing a beat, you know, began with the NFL. And the more he got into it, the NFL resisted. He began digging, began creating a whole discourse on the issue of concussions. And he changed the way the NFL dealt with it. He got into other sports, soccer. It is an example of how one journalist who tenaciously picks up an issue can have a disruptive impact. Looking back over the last 10 years, most of the stories that have had the greatest impact have been run by traditional news organizations. Pieces like Jane Mayer's report on the Koch brothers in the New Yorker changed the whole discussion on that. Dana Priest in the Washington Post reporting on Walter Reed. Remember all the abuses that were going on there. Matt Taibbi in the Rolling Stone wrote about Goldman Sachs. Until that point, nobody would talk about that place. It was too powerful. And he, with his image of the vampire squid wrapped around a building, sucking profits out of things, just shocked people and has had a big impact. And there are very few stories in digital journalism over its first 20 years that can compare with that, I think. So here I'm going to move into, time remaining, the second part of my talk. So far I've discussed my disappointments with the web and its failure to, lack of innovation, its missing sense of urgency and mission. And now I want to talk about what I would like to see the web do more of. So if we go back to Martin Luther and his assault on the medieval order anchored by the Catholic Church, what would a similar issue be like today? So in two other articles that I wrote, as these were 4 articles altogether, I talked about the closest equivalent today to the church back then is the oligarchy in America. It's the 1%. It's the concentration of wealth in America and the world and the way money, power, and influence intersect. I think this is the issue that is most in need of journalistic scrutiny and analysis. So how could journalists take advantage of the powers of digital technology to do a better job in reporting on this world and sort of pulling the veil off of it? And of course there is a lot done on this, but I'm going to make the case that it's barely scratched the surface. So of all the digital products out there, there's one that I think offers the model or the vehicle for doing this. It's DealBook. DealBook is the online daily financial report of the New York Times. I don't know how many of you read it. They also run occasional pieces. Actually, every week they run a number of pieces in the print edition. It mainly reports on Wall Street. It has a number of sections: hedge funds, mergers and acquisitions, venture capital, IPOs, and regulation. Has a dozen or so reporters posting constantly on these issues. It has a number of columnists, and it uses tables and charts, and it's very quick, and you can constantly update and post. So it's really a great vehicle, I think. And they have produced a number of hard-hitting pieces. They did one in 2013, for instance, revealing how a bill that weakened a section of the Dodd-Frank Financial Reform Act was written almost word for word by Citibank. So this is, very good reporting. Overall, though, I think the DealBook section barely scratches the surface of Wall Street and the financial world. Day to day, it focuses heavily on earnings, CEO comings and goings, board activities, and deals. And that's its name, DealBook. So that's what its main bread and butter is. Now, of course, I don't have to tell you the Times does, in general, a lot of scrutinizing of the world of Wall Street and financial power and the like. And it has a shelf full of Pulitzers to show for it. But the Times, to me, is beholden to the same traditional investigative methods that I was talking about before. Long, discrete exposés of particular abuses, rather than an ongoing examination of how wealth is converted into power and influence in America. Its investigations tend to be one-offs or two-offs or maybe three-offs, not the ongoing coverage of the type the Boston Globe did with the church sex abuse scandal or that Alan Schwartz did with concussions. So I'm proposing a new methodology that would use a DealBook-like structure to get at this world. And so I'm going to take you through the process of how I developed this proposal that I have for digital journalism having a real sense of mission in what I think is in many ways the issue of our day. So I started with a DealBook posting on the top 5 hedge fund earners in 2014. They listed these 5 guys. Number 1, Kenneth Griffin, head of the Chicago-based Citadel hedge fund. Made $1.3 billion in 2014. Now, the Times gave only a thumbnail sketch of him. And I wanted to learn more. So I just began searching on the web for what I could learn about Mr. Griffin. And I was amazed at how much information there was. He's considered the richest man in Illinois. He's the 13th largest contributor to super PACs. He helped fund the races of Bruce Rauner, a Republican for governor in Illinois, and for Rahm manual Democrat election race for mayor and played a key role in financing both successful campaigns. Citadel recently hired Ben Bernanke to be a consultant, the head of the Fed. I mean, talk about the revolving door. He can buy the former head of the Fed to advise and, of course, open doors for them in Washington. He's a trustee of the Art Institute of Chicago and the Whitney Museum. He's a director of the Economic Club of Chicago. He's on the advisory board of the Eurasia Group, a risk assessment firm, and a trustee of the University of Chicago. Finally, he's a member of something called the Committee on Capital Markets Regulation, a group I hadn't heard of. But I went to it and I saw it's one of the dozens of these trade groups that Wall Street has to try to fight regulation, keep the government small, protect capital. So I began looking at that, you do these links, click on the thing. So I go to this site, the Committee on Capital Markets Regulation. So I looked at its board of directors, and it's opening to me this world. There's Glenn Hubbard, the dean of the Columbia Business School. Abigail Johnson, CEO of Fidelity, worth about $11 billion. John Thornton, former head of Goldman Sachs, now co-chair of the Brookings Institution. And Paul Singer, the head of Elliott Management Hedge Fund. As I began looking into the background of these people, I became fascinated by Paul Singer. I had not heard of him. This was a number of months ago. He's gotten a little more attention since. But he seemed to typify to me the way today's ultra-rich amass tremendous power while staying out of the limelight. So what did I find? Again, I can run through, I go with this in my article if you want to look, but he's worth about $2 billion, one of the largest donors to the Republican Party, instrumental in the selection of Paul Ryan as Mitt Romney's running mate. He makes a fortune by buying up the distressed debt of both companies and countries like Argentina, and then uses his power when they run into the problem to make them pay nearly a full amount. He's chairman of the Manhattan Institute, a conservative think tank, member of the board of commentary, a major donor to the American Enterprise Institute, and a major contributor to groups dedicated to a strong Israel. The one exception to this profile is he's a strong defender, backer of gay rights. It so happens his son is gay. So there's one area in which he sort of, it's interesting, his personal situation has led him to support that. So I found all this information on the web. So much is out there, but no one is really connecting these dots. And I felt that with a different mindset, DealBook or a site like it could become a vehicle for burrowing into the world of the 1% and create a database showing all these interconnections, the boards, the donations, the causes, how they make their money and the like. To return to Singer, I found, for instance, a remarkable involvement in the charter school movement. He's one of many hedge fund billionaires who have become very active in supporting charters. And with more searching, I found this remarkable amount of information about the web of connections between hedge funds, charters, and campaign contributions to New York State politicians. In 2014, he gave $500,000 to a hastily assembled PAC, New Yorkers for a Balanced Albany, whose main goal was to elect Republican state legislators and keep the New York legislature in Republican hands. This PAC was organized by Students First New York, an advocacy group for charter schools, founded by people like Joel Klein, who's a big advisor to Rupert Murdoch, and two hedge fund billionaires. Singer was one of a dozen titans who gave $4 million to this PAC. These same people gave money to Governor Cuomo for his political campaigns. And the governor, lo and behold, is a big supporter of charter schools. Basically, then, I found a nexus in which hedge fund managers provide money for charter schools. The charter schools provide a grassroots movement that agitates for Republican legislators who support charter schools and who also happen to oppose raising taxes, which pleases the hedge fund billionaires, one of whose main goals is keeping taxes low. This, I think, explains why hedge fund managers are such enthusiastic backers of charter schools. Keeping tax, put tension on charter schools, you don't have to worry about the deficit in funding for public schools, which in New York is about $6 billion according to the court judgment. Paying that would require more taxes on the wealthy. Now, all this is speculative. Why are so many hedge fund people backing charter schools? I don't know the answer, but it should be researched. I got some of this information out of the New York Times, like, picking here and there. Nobody, again, is connecting. I don't know why. To me, it's a natural subject. So actually, in terms of why, this is the one point where I wish I had audio video, but the photo editor of the New York Review for my article, this is Reimagining Journalism, the Story of the 1%. Here they found a photo. Here is Paul Singer, and he's talking to Andrew Ross Sorkin, who is the founder of DealBook and the sort of top financial editor reporter at the New York Times. This is at a conference. Look at these two, you can't see, but these two guys are sort of, having a nice discussion. And DealBook has a conference every year, and they invite Lloyd Blankfein and Jamie Dimon and other big bankers and interview them. And, to think that these things do not have an effect on the journalist, you have to be naive. It really does. And this type of accessing and rubbing shoulders is, I think, one of the reasons why Paul Singer is able to remain so hidden in spite of the remarkable public profile that he has. In my piece, I go into how not only the charter schools, but also at the national level, education is dominated by three foundations. Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which has $40 billion in assets, making it by far the biggest foundation in the world. The Eli and Edith Broad Foundation, which does a lot of training of education people. And the Walton Foundation, which is the Walmart, money from Walmart. And they've given over $1 billion in this whole area for what's called the education reform movement. Charter schools, standardized testing, merit pay, and the like. They call it the reform movement, and it's, we can get into the issue of how much it is. Arne Duncan, as Secretary of Education, was close to these foundations. And under him and President Obama, the policies of these foundations became largely the policy of the federal government. So it's an illustration of how in America, private money today can buy public policy. Now, a DealBook-like site on the Power Elite could have an education page reporting on all these groups and foundations and contributors, the lobbyists, the activities that they do. It would also include the teachers' unions, who are major players in all this. And you want to have everyone on all sides involved. And you could do regular posting on all this and show the interconnections. It could also be a sounding board for teachers, parents, and principals, and the recipients of grants from these foundations. Often they're afraid to speak frankly about what it's like dealing with them because they're getting money from them. But if you had a sounding board, I think you could actually get a very interesting conversation going. So the type of site I have in mind would deal with the place of money in our society. It would look at the boards people sit on, the causes they give to, the trade groups that represent them, where they live, who they mix with. I mean, this world is largely hidden from view. And I don't want to make it sound like I'm going after individuals. That sometimes makes people uncomfortable. Again, to cite Spotlight, for those of you who saw it, for me this key moment is when the journalist, Liv Schreiber plays Marty Baron, who was brought in as the editor. And he wanted to get at this issue, which had been percolating, but no one had really, the paper had not tackled it. And so he got the Spotlight investigative unit to do more looking into it. And they did, and they found 13 priests who had been accused of and found to have committed sexual abuse. And they were amazed because nobody knew it was that many. And so they came to him, the Spotlight unit, and said, well, we've got 13 people. It's time to run with the story, right? He says, you don't understand. We're going after the structure of this, the institutional framework of it. I want you to keep digging and find out there are more people and who covered up. And so that is sort of what I want to get at. I mean, I want to do the structure of these things, and the individuals are part of a much bigger phenomenon. In the second of my two articles, I talked about the many areas that I think this type of technique could be used to look at. Philanthropy, for instance. There's been an explosion of giving as wealth has exploded. And there are a tremendous number of foundations out there that are not being looked at. And these are very activist people. Like Mark Zuckerberg, he gave, as you probably know, $100 million for the New York schools. He wanted to make it the best school system in the country. So they hired somebody, hired consultants at $1,000 a day. It was all top down. Parents, superintendents, teachers had very little input. And it totally failed. It was a fiasco. And Mark Zuckerberg himself has admitted this. And Zuckerberg has now said he's going to give $40 billion of his wealth to do philanthropic work. So who's going to watch this? And of course, it's all a tax write-off, so it's partly a taxpayer expense. Much of today's philanthropy is directed at intellectual capture, the effort to affect public opinion and win over people to a particular viewpoint. And this is an area that just, again, needs tremendous attention. Think tanks. We need people writing about think tanks. Corporate money is invading AEI, Brookings, and I'm going to skip over some of the examples of this, but they're getting these think tanks to do research in areas that they want, and it inevitably ends up putting forth a viewpoint that supports their own interest. And it's not just conservatives. The super rich include many liberals who are using their money to promote favorite causes. Something like the Democracy Alliance, which was founded in 2005, in part in response to how good conservatives were at funding things. And it has 100 or so donors committed to giving at least $200,000 a year to 21 sanctioned organizations like the Center for American Progress and Media Matters. And it's very secretive. It's very hard to get information, but you could dig it up. Higher education is another field. We all know about names going on buildings. I mean, this is the Filene Auditorium. That comes from the Filene basement fortune. But I'm more interested in the intellectual capture aspect. Professorships and institutions are being set up by the wealthy. John Paulson, for one, a hedge fund manager, in 2009 gave NYU $20 million to create an Alan Greenspan chair in economics and a John Paulson professor of finance and alternative investments. Who are filling these? Does he get to decide? Are they fitting his own agenda or ideology? BB&T, a major finance services company in North Carolina, has given millions to more than 60 colleges and universities to examine the moral foundations of capital and to promote the works of Ayn Rand. So these places do have clearly some control over the research produced, the professors hired, even the courses taught. University boards of trustees is another major area. These are being taken over by people in finance, real estate, law, construction, and marketing. NYU, which has had a tremendous controversy recently because of this grand expansion plan they have, not only in Greenwich Village, but around the world to set up campuses in many places that don't have freedom of speech or that abuse workers. You went to look at their board, 60 trustees. All but 2 or 3 are from these areas of finance, construction, real estate, and the like. Virtually no people in education or on the faculty or on these boards. So we were talking, I mean, Dartmouth, I understand, is not that different from any other place, but nobody's watching this. And in public education, public universities, it's particularly bad because state legislatures are cutting back funding. They have to do more fundraising. It's creating an opening for money to get into control positions at universities. To cite an example, in North Carolina last year, Republican legislators working with the Board of Governors forced out the popular president, Tom Ross. They replaced him with Margaret Spellings. She was the Secretary of Education under George W. Bush, and he had been working as the head of the George W. Bush Presidential Center. So many people were very upset on the campus, seeing it as a politically motivated appointment. Now, one can make the argument that universities are too liberal. They don't have enough conservatives. So why not bring in more people? And why not, indeed? But not through this way, through using money as a leverage to gain more control. I have a whole thing about David Rubenstein. He believes in, you have to look at the sources of wealth of these people. David Rubenstein is co-CEO of the Carlyle Group, worth $2.5 billion. And he specializes in something called patriotic philanthropy. He's given $9 million to the National Zoo for panda reproduction, $7.5 million to help repair the Washington Monument, $10 million to help restore Monticello. This has led to very flattering pieces in the Washington Post and New York Times, and 60 Minutes had a big flattering segment called All American. How does this man have enough to repair the Washington Monument when the federal government doesn't? Well, the federal government, one reason it doesn't have as much money is because these people have figured out ways to use the tax code to keep so much money to themselves. And I have a whole thing in here about the Carlyle Group. If any of these pieces looked at this private equity company and how they make their money, they are called the Ex-President's Club because they get literally the two George Bushes, James Baker, John Major, the former British PM. They use influence to open up doors in Washington, get inside tracks. They just hired Julius Janikowski, who was head of the FCC, and they're moving into the telecommunications world. They're buying up properties, restructuring them, and then selling them off. A lot of people feel that private equity and hedge funds have had a major part in magnifying income inequality in America. And yet, a place like DealBook only skims the surface in looking at them. And why is that? I mean, I'm sort of stunned that they're not just a more natural curiosity about this. Yeah, okay. So basically, I'm proposing a site that would do all this work. And you'd have a crack staff, you'd have, it'd be a site where you could have this database, you could do a lot of interaction, find the interlinks. It could be an alternative to Google and Wikipedia when people go to search things. And I have ideas that things they could do. They could hire financial bloggers to write about the inner workings of Wall Street, send video crews to places like Greenwich, Connecticut and Palm Beach to see how the mega rich live, file dispatches from elite gatherings like the Bow Forum, which is Asia's Davos, and Sun Valley, where a lot of media wheeling dealing goes on. They could report on the world of galas and debutante balls and private schools and exclusive retreats, and do John Oliver-like send-ups of the ways in which corporations use frontmen, hired researchers, and fake grassroots groups to promote their interests and mislead the public. So finally, the great question would be how to pay for all this. Based on what I said about the Huffington Post and others, I don't think a for-profit model would work. If you want to drive traffic, that's not the way to do it. So I think doing this type of thing would mean one would have to go to philanthropists, the very type of people who I'm talking about. So the question I end up is there a group of big money donors out there willing to fund an operation that would lift the curtain on their own world? So we'll see if that could be done. Thank you. Yeah.
To what extent does... One sec.
Hold it, get the microphone.
To what extent does a place like CRP, I guess its website is now called Follow the Money?
You mean...
Center for Responsive Politics.
Oh, Center for Responsive...
They sort of go in for building these networks, but they're very limited set of topics that they touch on.
You're absolutely right.
Are they a beginning model of this?
Yes. OpenSecrets.org, I think, is their website, if that's... yes. And it's brilliant. It is. It's a great data site. You can plug in the names of many of the people I've talked about, and they will show you. They're basically, there's the data there, and it's raw material that then has to be used. But the type of site I'm talking about would link into that. But it would be more on, it would have to have analysis to go with it and show you the way that these things operate. But it's a terrific site and invaluable to many journalists.
I know I'm old-fashioned, but if you still have something to do with the Columbia School of Journalism, to me, it would make more sense to urge print journalists to use the resources available, to go and look and to make the connections that you've talked about. Because I think that the internet has very siloed readership. There's tons out there, but finding them is not so obvious. And there are many of us who do look at the Times or BBC or the Post or things like that. So to teach writers and researchers to connect the dots the way you're talking about, I think would be really good.
Well, it's a very good idea. In fact, the Columbia Journalism School recently they created news because they actually revealed together, I think with the LA Times, about how ExxonMobil had misled the public about climate change, that they had sat on all the, sort of like what the tobacco industry did. But frankly, I don't think the journalism schools are, I mean, this will create upset. Columbia is captured by money right now. The president, I mean,
But the students are.
who's going to teach the students? You know, if they start doing, ExxonMobil put major pressure on the journalism school for doing this. The dean, Steve Cole, was the one who tipped them off because he wrote a book about the oil industry, or about ExxonMobil. And they began leaning on him. And that is one of the things that happens with these things. These people have lawyers, they have PR people. The students are not, I agree with you, the training should be that way. And the type of site I have in mind, which I'm actually exploring about making a reality, would try to train people. We need a new generation. So it's not just digital. It's sort of the tools that have to be used, and you use the technology as one of the tools. So thanks for the suggestion.
So you mentioned needing a new generation of journalists. Just anecdotally, and I'm happy to be corrected if I'm wrong, talking to some young people, they ended up basically doing volunteer labor for a lot of these digital sites. And they wanted to do more, but they were also supporting themselves on other jobs, often as things like consultants, where if their name is attached to anything that shows outrage, they can lose clients.
Hold it, where
You know,
is that?
They
Where?
can lose clients if they're consultants.
Oh, if they're consultants.
If they publish things that show outrage.
Mm-hmm.
Their labor was very much taken for granted. Their ideas often were rebuffed, and not just because of the
I'm sorry,
profit
who are
model.
you? You're talking about a specific group of people.
Just some young people I know.
Oh,
So I
okay.
said it's very anecdotal. It's young people who thought, well, I want to use my skills. I want to go into digital journalism. They had to do it basically as volunteer labor, and then very quickly discovered where all the barriers were and where their own ability to earn a living in another way was going to be obstructed.
Absolutely.
So the pressure is on like the bigger levels of the Columbia Law School, but it's also on the pressure of young people who still have their outrage, are paying off school loans, have to pay rent, and have jobs where I'd say there's sort of American pressure to be positive and show coercive ebullience all the time leads to them losing jobs. So I just wondered if you can sort of
Well,
talk
first of
more
all,
about
I do
volunteer
have-
labor.
It's reimagining journalism. So I'm not, the barriers are tremendous. I mean, even friends of mine at the Times, this idea of using the paper in this way gets a lot of hackles up. Look, though, on the other side, I mean, you're absolutely right. I was telling somebody that there was recently a ranking of 200 professions according to job prospects and what their fields look like. And of the 200, journalism ranked number 200. So it's not an ideal time. I used the word turmoil before. But look at the outrage out there, the Bernie Sanders outrage, the Donald Trump outrage. I mean, we're at a moment where politically it is out there. Now, these are the same young people we're talking about. So the question to me becomes, why isn't journalism doing more to harness that? I didn't mention how the Huffington Post, they still are using all these free bloggers. I mean, it's amazing. And now the deal is always, we give you this platform. You get your views out in a way that you wouldn't get otherwise. And some people are willing to make that bargain. But I know a lot of people who won't write for them for that reason. You usually get what you pay for, you know. So you've put your finger on something that's absolutely a big issue. But that's why we have to reimagine things. And I wish journalism were doing more to tap into the climate that's now building among young people. Yes, ma'am?
Have you heard about Blendle at all? Do you
No.
know about this new source? It's this news aggregator, sort of like 538 or The Skim or some of these other things, but you actually pay per article, and so you put money in, like $10 at a time, and it depletes, and so you pay 19 cents an article or whatever, so you're not subscribing to the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and all these different things. And I try to support it a little bit, but I work here, so I get them all for free. So, but I was wondering, I mean, what do you think of a model like that? Because I find myself torn between I want information and I want to see both sides, and I want free things too. It gets very complicated very quickly. So I guess I'm wondering.
Well, we have the phenomenon of crowdsourcing and also Kickstarter, which has become an avenue for supporting projects. Frankly, I think it's, you know, tenuous, but I do feel that, like, the type of work that I'm proposing, that people would be willing to support that. I've already had people like say, oh, that's the type of thing that I would like to support. In the long run, it's not going to be sufficient to do it. That's why I really feel like the nonprofit sector and all the money sloshing out there. You know, Piero Midyar has tried it, this guy, Herb Sandler. But it's difficult because once you start shaking things up, you're going to step on the toes of these people. And so you really have to find people who have an extraordinary willingness to tolerate that type of static.
All right.
You want to take one more? Or?
Sure. Go ahead.
Okay, last one.
Last one.
Coming back to your final point about how to finance this, you mentioned the possibility of philanthropy. I would suggest that another possibility is the model that is used by public radio and public television. I'll cite an example from around here. In Vermont, we have the VT Digger website, which recently broke the $200 million EB5 scandal.
What is that?
The EB5 visa program, where people foreigners can invest $500,000, create at least 10 jobs, and get a permanent green card. Now, this model was exploited up at the Jay Peak Resort in northeastern Vermont, but the people doing it looted $200 million at least, and now the SCC is going into it. But the VT Digger website spent 2 years working on this. The point being, I hope I've explained it satisfactorily, but the point being that they are funded in a way analogous to public radio and public television.
Well, I think that's, again, it's another type of model of the consumer supporting it. And public radio is so established and has that type of, people are now accultured to giving to support it. And I mean, it's an intriguing idea that I'll have to think about more. The problem is when you have these sites that are, you know, a lot of them try to do this, and they're always begging for money from their readers. Oh, we've been sending you this and so on. You're on our email list. Please give a contribution. But it's hard to do, and there's also so much competition for people's money out there because there's so many sites. I think you've got to get something that people really are going to value. I mean, they value the New York Times. I mean, they value the Wall Street Journal. They're willing to pay for that. But, you know, to come up with a new site online when there's so much else out there, you've got to have a good product. But I'll think more about that. It's good.
All right. Michael, thank you very much.
Thank you.